Please, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the final program in our Disability in the American Past series. If you missed any part of the series to date, the 4 panel discussions we've hosted this month, they'll be available at masshist.org/disability. We appreciate their help and support for and the support of our co-sponsoring organizations. You can learn more about all this at our website, which, as I mentioned, was masshist.org/disability. For anyone who may be joining the Massachusetts Historical Society for the first time, I want to take a moment to introduce the organization. We are the first historical society in America, dating back to 1791. We are an independent nonprofit organization that maintains a research library with close to 14 million pages of correspondence, diaries, and documents. We hold the papers of 3 US presidents, as well as mothers, inventors, preachers, and protesters. We make all this material available to researchers for free and also make throughout the year. We're able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. We hope you'll return for future events or to explore our collections. And of course, if you enjoy our programs, we hope you'll consider becoming a member. You're joined by 5 panelists and a moderator, which is a relatively large group. I will introduce our moderator, and we'll have very brief introductions of the panelists, but then we will post longer bios of them in the chat as we're going along, so you can read that. Our moderator this evening is Malia Lazu. She is a lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She is an award-winning strategist in diversity and inclusion and has sparked deep economic development and investment in urban entrepreneurship for over 20 years. In her most recent role as EVP and regional president at Berkshire Bank, Ms. Lazu worked to generate wealth for communities by expanding access to capital and spurring economic growth, especially in communities of color that have traditionally been left behind. A serial entrepreneur in her own right, Ms. Lazu has created and led a number of socially responsible business accelerators across Boston. And I'd also like to thank our ASL interpreter, who is joining us from Partners Interpreting, and our captioner, who is also joining us from Partners Interpreting. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to Malia.
Gavin, thank you so much. And thank you to both of our interpreters for joining us. I'm sorry, I'm Black, Puerto Rican, Italian, so I'm going to do my best to not totally talk too fast. It's a real honor to be here for this disability activism discussion on a historical perspective. As we know, we're really in the moment of a reckoning in America where we're deciding who gets to be seen, who gets to be included in this equity journey that we speak of. And we're going to be talking to, some of the Mount Rushmore leaders and activists when it comes to disability activism and activism in general. And it's my pleasure to now introduce our panelist, Fred Pelka, who is an author on disability rights, history, and known for his seminal works, The Oral History of Disability Rights. Heather Watkins, a Boston-based disability advocate, poet, writer, mother. Charlie Carr, he is a survivor of institutionalization. Amen. We're so glad you did, Charlie. And a lifelong disability advocate. And Keith Jones, an artist, rapper, and most recently, Emmy Award-winning Keith Jones. Thank you so much for joining us all. We have a lot to get into when we talk about the history till today. And so, Fred, you literally wrote the book on this. So I'd love to start with you and just give you a chance to please, talk to us about the history and the broad strokes of the movement and us getting to the ADA passing.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. At events like this, I always like to begin with a quote from one of my favorite historians, Douglas C. Bainton, who wrote an essay called Disability and the Justification of Inequality in American History. And he wrote, "Disability is everywhere in history once you begin looking for it, but conspicuously absent in the histories we write." And so I'd like to thank the Massachusetts Historical Society for hosting these programs and working to help correct that current reality. I've been asked to summarize or highlight some of the milestones leading to the passage of the ADA, which is itself a watershed in that history. Obviously, given the short time, this will of necessity be just a quick thumbnail sketch of a long, intricate, and nuanced history. Two thoughts I'd like to begin with. First, there is no homogeneous single disability rights movement. Paul Longmore, another historian, in his oral history, talks about how there are really at least a half a dozen movements about disability rights, and each one reflects the interests and issues and needs of a particular disability constituency. And he talks about the deaf community, the organized blind movement, the independent living movement, the psychiatric survivors movement, learning disabilities movement, developmental disabilities community. All of these have their own history, their own issues and insights. And in the last generation or so, at least since the 1970s, they've become allied with one another and around a common goal, which was to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. The second thing I'd like to point out is that this history goes back quite a way. We tend to focus on the last 20, 30, 40 years. As early as 1880, the National Association of the Deaf was founded as a response to the oralist movement, which had tried to basically destroy deaf culture and drive American Sign Language underground. In the 1930s, we had the League of the Physically Handicapped, which organized picket lines and sit-downs against employment discrimination by the Works Progress Administration. And in the 1940s, we had the National Federation of the Blind and the American Federation of the Physically Handicapped. The NFB still exists today. The American Federation basically ended in the early 1960s, late 1950s. And then in the 1950s, we had the parents movement, which also forms a large part of the movement leading into the Americans with Disabilities Act. One of the things that I think needs to be understood about these earlier movements is that the model they were working on, as I see it, was a labor model, a model of labor activism. In the analogy they were using was that people with disabilities are like exploited workers. And how do exploited workers how do they team together to fight their exploitation? They form unions and become activists in that way. The NFB, for example, among their first activism were protests against the appalling conditions at so-called sheltered workshops. The American Federation was one of the major organizers with Paul Strachan, who was a labor organizer before he became a disability rights organizer. They were involved with the Hire the Handicapped campaigns of the 1940s and 50s. I think a big change came with Brown v. Board, which of course is the landmark civil rights, right to education Supreme Court case in the mid-1950s. And I think what we see there is the beginning of a shift in that analogy to where we're now looking at people with disabilities as an oppressed minority as opposed to being exploited workers. And this opens up a whole new vista, a whole panoply of different strategies and tactics to use. So just a few real quick milestones. Park v. Pennsylvania, let's begin there. Park was at that time called the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children. It's not called that anymore. And they brought a class action federal lawsuit in 1969 against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This was a right to education case. Up until that time, it was routine for school districts across the country to deny children with disabilities any right to an education. And when they were permitted an education in the public schools, it was generally segregated and not up to the standards of a mainstream education. Park was decided in 1971, a consent decree, and this led to an explosion of disability rights litigation all across the country, and eventually to the passage of what was then called the Education of Handicapped Children Act of 1975. At about the same time, we had the passage of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. I'm skipping through these things really quickly. I mean, entire books have been written about Park. Entire books have been written about Section 504. So just real fast, what 504 did was it wrote into law a provision that said that any entity receiving federal funding could not discriminate against an otherwise qualified handicapped individual. This was passed after several vetoes by President Richard Nixon. There was a whole campaign of activism around that. Out of 504 came many of the concepts of disability rights law that were incorporated into the ADA: reasonable accommodation, readily achievable, etc. 504 also led to the HEW protest in 1977, which was a pivotal event. That was the occupation. It was a nationwide campaign, but the most famous and seminal part was the occupation of the federal building in San Francisco, and that had a galvanizing effect. The 504 workshops, which were, again, a whole huge part of the history. These were workshops that were put together by activists around the country: Dredif on the West Coast, Pilkop on the East Coast, to educate a cadre of disability rights activists across disability to begin advocating for their rights. All of this led to what's been called the golden era of disability rights legislation. So just the Air Carriers Access Act of 1986, Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1987, all of these culminating in the passage of the ADA in 1990. Quickly on the Civil Rights Restoration Act, which doesn't get a lot of attention, but I think is really important. This was really the first time that national disability rights activists were in league with activists from other civil rights communities across the country. The Civil Rights Restoration Act was in response to a Supreme Court decision that essentially gutted provisions of Title IX, Civil Rights Act of 1964, and elder rights. So it drew in all of these constituencies. So just really quickly to cap up here. So we have litigation, we have legislative lobbying, and then the final instance I would talk about is direct action. And I'll give you two examples of that, and then I'll end this. One is ADAPT, an organization that specializes, I would say, in nonviolent civil disobedience. They just one instance of their campaign would be the occupation of the Capitol Rotunda in 1990 to bring about the passage of the ADA. And then another example would be the Deaf President Now campaign at what was then Gallaudet College, is now Gallaudet University. This was in 1988. And this was a campaign to essentially force the Board of Trustees at Gallaudet to appoint, for the first time in its history, a deaf president at the premier higher education institution in the deaf community. Gallaudet had been founded in 1864. Its charter was signed by Abraham Lincoln, and from 1864 to 1988, it had not ever had a deaf president. And when the Board of Trustees in 1988 decided to appoint yet another hearing president, the students rose up, occupied the campus, and forced a reversal of that decision. So that is really quick, down and dirty
Yes.
Encapsulation of that history, but
People
there's
have
so much
gotten a
more.
whole lot of Googleable facts.
Yes, yes.
A lot of moments in history to talk about. And it's really so important because none of this stuff comes out of a vacuum, right? It all comes out of, we all walk in the footsteps of our elders and, and the folks who help pave the way. And Charlie, I'd love to bring you in now, to talk about your own experience working as an advocate and talk a little bit about the leaders, who inspired you, who, let you know that you were about to fight able-bodied supremacy and you were going to win.
Thank you, Malia. I also want to begin my remarks by thanking the Massachusetts Historical Society. When I saw the invitation, I kind of pinched myself because, here is a storied organization that has now embraced disability. And I want to give you props for that because we don't see too many established entities doing that. So you're certainly leading the pace. I found myself living in an institution when I was in my late teens. I had a traumatic disability and became paralyzed. And when I was done with my, acute hospitalization and what was loosely termed rehab, I was determined that I was not capable of living in the community, even with my family. So in those days, the late 60s, the default for people like me was to be put into an institution, namely a nursing home or some other type of an institution. So I was, and from age 15 until 22, I was institutionalized in one of several Massachusetts institutions. So I had heard about CI, Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, California, while I was living in this Middlesex County hospital. And I was like thinking, wow, this is what I want. What I want is to regain control of my life, get the hell out of there, because that was prison, and it still is prison, sadly, for many, many people. I had the good fortune of meeting a man who also had a disability, was a little older than me, but I thought was pretty cool. He would come in and visit, and his name is Fred Fay. And Fred was a guy who was pretty smart, educated psychologist, actually. And he would come and say, anybody feel like talking? And that eventually became what we now know as peer counseling. We talked and, what's it like? What do you want to do? All that kind of stuff. So I bonded with this guy right out of the gate because he was living in the community. He was married. He had a child. He owned a home. These are all things I wanted to do. So that's how I met my mentor. And I was following Fred until the day he died. But I think for me, my activism was basically, I'll be flat out honest. It wasn't altruistic. It was survival. It's pure and simple. How do I get out of this institution that's robbed my control, forced me to live in a medical facility, following their rules? What time do I get up? What time do I eat? What time do I go to bed? these are all things that are predetermined. I had no say.
Mm.
I didn't want to do that anymore. So I loved this independent living idea. So I began to work with Fred and others on the outside. Elmer Bartels, a legend in our community. And we collaborated to start an independent living center. And in 1974, the Boston Center for Independent Living was incorporated, the second independent living center in the country, in the world for that matter. And so that came with a lot of hard work, occupying a state office to get the personal care assistance program started and a number of other skirmishes. So I think for me, my activism is rooted in survival. And you know, I couldn't imagine living in a room the same size as a jail cell for the rest of my life. And so from there, BCIL was started. It was primarily a way to get Medicaid funding into the hands of the likes of me to hire attendants. And in order to do that, you had to have a third party entity, and BCIL was that third party. And they also had a residential program for people to live. And from there, I just went on in the realm of independent living, which is what it became known as, because prior to that, it was just didn't exist. We were all locked up, right? So I went from there, and I would begin fighting battles that span all of the issues that Fred mentioned. I started an independent living center in 1980 that still exists today, and it was modeled after Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. I grew that entity with some incredibly talented people with me, and I was involved in the creation of the National Council of Independent Living, because states finally received federal money to do independent living, and Massachusetts was one of them. And after a while, we all, from these 10 states that were funded, thought it would be a good idea to get together and see what each other was doing. And that eventually evolved into the National Council of Independent Living, where we would actually develop some political clout, some organization around how do we advocate nationally. And we were very instrumental in eventually pushing and funding, pushing and enforcing the Americans with Disabilities Act. I first got involved nationally with the legislation that Fred referenced, which was the Civil Rights Restoration Act. That was the precursor to the ADA. And I remember looking around the room in DC and seeing all these people from all these organizations from around the country that weren't just disability. There were women, there were others, people of color. It was a very diverse group of people. So I've taken that, those opportunities, and I definitely consider them opportunities. I never would have been able to do it otherwise, and brought them home and done my best to ensure that the ADA in this case was actually implemented, because a law on the books is just that. It's a law on the books. And until you operationalize it, it may or may not do anything. So that's my story. And I could go on, but activism for me is a necessity. And we need replacements, folks.
That's right. That's right. You know, the younger generation. Well, and it's funny because, and I'm not sure, Gavin, you'll let me know if John joins. But we were going to have John Chappell join you, and he hasn't joined us on the Zoom yet. But you and he, mark this generation, right, of movement leaders. And I'd like to now call in Heather and Keith, who, I remember when Keith was at the Boston Center for Independent Living, right, where he was a benefit of, in teaching others, but also being able to live independently because of the path that you, Charlie, and others paved. And so it's so wonderful to now have this intergenerational conversation. Although I want to be clear, these folks ain't young. They're the same age. They're around the same age as me. And we probably went to high school with Charlie. So we like to, but, Heather and Keith, I'd love for you to talk to us about that next generation, right? Like the folks who were benefiting from Charlie being like, no, we're not being in a jail cell. Like, like that's not our journey, not today. And tell us about how you became organizers and movement leaders. And Heather, let's start with you.
Sure. So I really got involved out of pure frustration. I was born with a form of muscular dystrophy. I didn't always use mobility aids like I do now. I use a cane and a manual wheelchair on occasion when I'm out and about. If I'm inside, my furniture is strategically placed, or I'm holding on to walls. So for many years, I appeared non-disabled until you saw me walk up a flight of stairs or try to run, which I couldn't do. I couldn't lift heavy things. I was given like an elevator key in high school. And so I kind of just ambulated as best I could. Again, without the use of mobility aids at that time, going along to get along. And then it was many years later when my disability actually started to progress and my balance started to change. And then it started to affect my respiratory muscles, where it forced me to stop working as much and really, really consider, the trajectory of my life and contemplate, okay, where are you going with this? What do you want to do next? And it became really important because I was also a disabled parent. And my daughter was only about 9-10 years old. And so I just kind of began thinking about my world and my relationship to what it meant to just be here and be alive. And, I started considering all of those things swirling around in my head. And I was thinking, I have these little eyes watching me that are so impressionable. How is she going to, follow your lead if you're responding in a particular manner? And so that was kind of like what spurred me to look a little deeper. And so when I stopped work and kind of concentrated on my health a little more, because I had become hypoxic at the same time, which really was me waking up with these migraine headaches because my respiratory muscles weren't strong enough to get rid of the carbon dioxide that was building up. So long story short, I was hospitalized, came home with oxygen therapy, and was placed with my little mechanical ventilator that I use at night, similar to what people use if they have sleep apnea. So during that time, I had a lot of time to really think about what's next for me. And in doing so, I would just ask myself, what do you want to do next? What's really important to you? And what kept coming back to me was, how was I going to get around as well? What was my quality of life going to be? How did I see myself in the world? What was my new identity? And so while I was having all of these thoughts and kind of just considering my new normal, I'm driving around and I'm wondering why in my own community in Rosendale, section of Boston, why did I see so many stairs to local businesses? Why did I see, a lot of these points of inaccessibility? And it was frustrating me. So I'm sitting at a stoplight one day and I'm like, why don't more people care about these things? And then I got a light bulb moment that was like, why don't you care about it? Why don't you do something about it? And so that's kind of how the ball got started rolling. And then I remember, a couple of weeks later, just sitting at home and I'm watching TV and I see a news broadcast and they were talking to another advocate who was in my same section of the city in Rosendale. And they were talking about the frustration they were having in the community. And this person was Liz Casey, and she was associated with Boston Center for Independent Living. And I was like, you know what? I was so keyed into that broadcast. And I was thinking, all right, you know what? I'm going to connect with her in the morning, some way, somehow. I got up the next day, called BCIL, and I was like, how can I connect with Liz Casey? Lo and behold, they gave me her contact info. I called her on a hunch and I said, all she can do is say no or not pick up. Called her up, connected, and she was thrilled. And I was telling her, I saw you, love to connect with you. I would, just want to find out how we can make this community a little bit better. And we met at a local Starbucks and we got the ball rolling from there. And then from there, she connected me with more folks through BCIL. And then I got connected with the Boston Disability Advisory Commission, which I became a member of when they reconvened the board in August of 2009. And since then, it's really been a whirlwind to connect with so many local artists and advocates in the community, and in particular, more people of color. Because once you have a diverse set of folks that, mirrors your experience and not, so many different kinds of folks living with all kinds of disabilities, I think was really key for me, because we don't see that often, across the media landscape. And that does it does a disservice to your own self-awareness. So that's how I really got started. That
if you can't see it, you didn't even know that there was a way to advocate for yourself, right, Heather? You didn't even know there was a community of folks already saying this is some BS and we gonna do something about it. So then when you got to hear about it, you were, oh, well, wait a second. Like, I got a sign. Let me show up.
Absolutely. Because my first sort of, if you can say, entree into the community was through the charity model.
Right.
Like MDA, Muscular Dystrophy Association. They were the only ones that were doing outreach that I was aware of in my community. And
they're not run necessarily by people of the community, right? I mean, it's like any charity model, right? Like a majority of charities, are run by white folks that help Black people, right? So it's like that, right? No, Keith.
Yes.
Let's jump in and hear your story, and also because we're in community for the first time since Keith has gotten his Emmy, and I saw it. He sent a picture. Yeah. Heather saw it. It's really at his house, y'all. We saw it. It's real. It wasn't just some cutout cardboard. So I just want to congratulate you publicly, my friend, for winning that and for being able to be such a great talent from local talent. You Oompa, I'm like, yo, we got albums coming out, y'all. We got albums coming out. But Keith, full disclosure for everyone, that Keith was one of my first friends in Boston. Like, just hands down. I had moved from Hawaii. I was working at Express. And I used to pick out like dope clothes. So Keith was looking fly, fancy, fresh. And Keith was really kind enough in my entree into the disability movement. So Keith, can you tell us a little bit about, how you came and any thoughts that you may have on intergenerational? And then we're going to jump to some audience questions because we have some great ones.
Okay. Well, first I want to thank National Historical Cultural Society for having me, and thank you all for letting me slide on the panel. And yes, for those who don't know, behind the scenes, I was running on CP time, so you can just say crippled people, colored people, depending on what day you want to talk. And it's an honor to be on the panel with such a, everybody I'm on the panel with are all my heroes. So I kind of sit back and go, ooh, look, I know the cool people. But the way that I came into this is ironic because you heard the history of disability in terms of the law. And if you start tracking the law post 1954, 1965, that's when my journey begins, coming from the Midwest. So coming from Missouri real quick, particularly because we're talking about history, Missouri was basically the start of the Wild West. So we had the Missouri Compromise with Dred Scott. So you have the entrenched racism. That was, was kind compared to the ableism. So my journey to activism wasn't this, I wanted to grow up to be a world famous rapper, aeronautical engineer / president. So how I ended up in the disability rights movement was by happenstance and by luck. I didn't really get mainstreamed until 1976, and that was in upstate New York at the Bosse School, being the only child of color, the only child with a disability in the entire school district, because we were slowly mainstreaming. I didn't get to Boston until 1981. I came in, had never seen an ocean, and then when I landed, there was flight 800 in the ocean, so I was panicking. I was like, they about to kill everybody, and on this plane, didn't know. Landed in Boston in 81, and coming from the Midwest, Boston's history was, Schoolhouse Rock started the revolution, the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, all of these very revolutionary things in terms of people of color, nothing about disability. And coming from the middle of the country, racism existed before school and after school, because I was Black and crip. I was the word up until we all got put on that school bus. Then, so if you were white or Black, whatever, there was no more in this and that. It was we all crip on that, because it didn't matter where you went in the city. You could only go to 2 schools. Getting to Boston was my third experience with busing, and coming out of the end of the busing of Boston, it was going through the traditional neighborhood of South Boston that was mighty Irish at the time, going to Columbia Point at the John W. McCormick and having bottles thrown at the bus, then going to school out in West Roxbury and having to fight to get just to be in regular classes, quote unquote. But every law that you heard in the introduction, everything that Charlie talked about, everything that Heather talked about, I intersected with that on my journey. Intersecting with you when you started Boston Vote and asking about why are we not having accessible ballots? And so the irony is I worked at the Boston Center for Independent Living, and I went in to cut somebody out for something, and they was like, "Oh, you want a job?" I was like, "Well, I'm good, I guess." And so it was working at BCIL and having people come in and looking at my life and saying, "I want to be able to have a girlfriend, go out to eat, go hang out and go to Slade's, and go just travel," was so beyond the fast, because people had been so amazed that a person with a cerebral palsy wanted to have kids. I was told everything that Charlie's talking about, everything that you're hearing, was 30 years later. So my stumbling into this in terms of the last 25 years, God, I'm old. The last 25 years is that it was necessity, survivability. You heard this earlier. That's
right.
But even more so, the intersection of history with the understanding of Boston's liberty and Massachusetts' role in the founding of the nation, and its same intersection of oppression with people of color and disabilities really pushed me to say, this doesn't make any sense. And particularly the work at the Independent Living Center, where I was sent into places with the deaf community, the development of this community, the autistic community, spinal cord injury community. My perception was, we are not working together, because you have these very siloed. I was an Easter Seal child. on Channel 5, of the United Cerebral Palsy child on Channel 4. But it was never about my humanity. It was always, oh, look at the shiny Negro and he's crippled, please send us some money.
Right.
And so the policy, so the activism really came about not just disability, my humanity, your humanity.
That's right.
So if the only reason I can't go to class is because I'm sexy and I have cerebral palsy, that's not a reason to keep me out of physics. But
Right.
what child is coming behind me to see the ability? So my journey through all of this has really been survivability, practicality, and just as a parent, as a father, as a son, wanting to move the world into a better place.
Right. I mean, I think all of you point out that the necessity of you all realizing, again, this ain't my lot, and it doesn't have to be my lot. And I think, Fred points out, what was it back in the, 1880, right? The Association of the Deaf, where folks were like, hey, no, we're not rolling that way anymore, And I'd like to run to our first question, and this is open to anybody, Charlie, Fred, Heather, or Keith. But someone wanted to talk about the non-obvious disabilities, and how do we make sure that everyone sees themselves as a part of the disability movement as we know it today. So who wants to take the first crack at talking about making sure that people with non-obvious disabilities are included in our conversations?
Oh, I'll do it. And then
Keith, you take the first crack. And I may be a little more conscious of time now because we are coming to the end, and I want to make sure we can get in as many questions as possible.
Wow.
So I'll be concise. Well, first and foremost, identity and identifiers. People have to be comfortable in their skin and acknowledge who they are and how they are. How you can come to the movement is you show up. And more importantly, the movement has to be accessible for everybody. You heard it before, most of these things are siloed, but in terms of non-apparent disabilities, whether you're neurodivergent, whether you have mental health challenges, you have to be able to, one, acknowledge your humanity and say you're part of this community so that we can recognize you and accept you and embrace your fullness. And secondly, we as a movement have to do better in saying this is not about, just communication aids or physical accessibility. This is about a quality of life that is self-defined by us, that is underpinned by social activism, public policy, and community support.
Does anyone want to add on to that? Heather, I see you came off mute.
Yeah, I try to be very explicit about it whenever I'm talking about disability and saying, it's apparent, non-apparent, and includes chronic illness, because unless and until that is a well-known fact and it's understood, people will always think, it's been my experience that people think you're only talking about wheelchair users. And so you have to be explicit about it. And I've been doing that for quite a while now, until people really, conceptualize disabilities in a more broader sense. So,
yeah, I would add, this is a question that's been with the movement really forever. I'm a psychiatric survivor, so I have a disability that has to do a lot with the label as opposed to the actual disability. But that's been a struggle. Is how do we incorporate people from the broad spectrum of the community? And I'd even broaden that a little bit. The disability community is it has all the problems that are entrenched in American society in general. I mean, white supremacy, homophobia, sexism, all of these things. Just because you're a person with a disability doesn't mean you are immune from all of the various poisons that are so prevalent in our culture. And so that's a continual struggle. In the 1980s and 90s, there were people organizing what was called the HIV/AIDS Disability Coalition. Incorporating people with AIDS into the community, that was something of a struggle. incorporating the Free Sharon Kowalski campaign to advocate on behalf of a woman who was a lesbian who was being discriminated against because she was gay and because she was a woman and because she was disabled. Talk about intersectionality. This is an ongoing struggle, and you know, I think people in the community are aware of it, but it's, as I say, it's a continuous process, and
Right.
We have to model that.
I would just quickly add that people with visible, non-visible disabilities are victims of stigma. There are social narratives that go on about them, and you know, it's a function of time before we claim who we are. We're proud of who we are, and we're willing to come out and identify ourselves and fight for the humanity that Keith referenced, to be a person, to be a parent, to be a father, to be a grandfather, to be the person that everybody else is, but I just happen to be different.
That's right. That's right.
Can I also just say too,
Self-determination.
I'm sorry, Lily, I just wanted to jump in real quick too, because how many of us would have benefited, you know, had we learned a lot of this, you know, in grade school, if we learned how many of our forebears had disabilities. So I know the topic of history is so timely right now for so many reasons, but I would have been beneficially impacted had I known about, you know, civil rights icons like Fannie Lou Hamer, who had disabilities, you know, Harriet Tubman, Brad Lomax, Sojourner Truth, you know, and not only for young people, but newly disabled folks, so that they have an understanding that disability also is so, you know, fully ingrained in a person's life that it alters the trajectory of their life, but how they govern their lives. And so it's really important if we learn about disabilities at an early age. I mean, I really didn't know anything about the ADA and its signing until after I got involved in disability rights. I didn't learn about that in school. I was 17 years old when the ADA passed. I was a rising senior. No one talked about it in high school.
Right. No, it wasn't. And, you know, this also, I want to ask you all about, you know, how, and then we'll get to, actually, let me ask the audience question first, because I did say I would do that. I was just into this conversation, so let's put a pin in that. I just can't wait for you all to get your own show, and I would like to just be a regular guest. Like, maybe I can come in and talk about like the hot, like, you know, cultural topics or something like that. But specifically for Fred or any other panelist here, do you have any must-read histories of disability rights? And I think your book, Fred, which I didn't get the name right, so I'd like you to repeat it correctly. Yeah. That is definitely a must-buy, and you can get it at UMass Press.
Yes, it's called What We Have Done, and it's an oral history of the disability rights movement. I spent 10 years, actually more maybe, interviewing leaders, foot soldiers, activists, witnesses, litigators, and kind of compress that all into a history of the movement. There are a bunch of books. I have so many books to recommend. Kim Nielsen has written a disability.
You also the oral history at Bancroft.
Well, yeah. The Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, did a series of oral histories, and I was involved with that. And you can go to their website and read those oral histories. Fred Fay is one of the people who I had the great privilege of interviewing, but a lot of our heroes are there. Kim Nielsen wrote A Disability History of the United States, which is really, really good. I love this book. This is an oldie, but it's a great one. It's called Deaf Heritage, and it's a history of the deaf community. It was published before the Deaf President Now campaign, so it goes right up to Deaf President Now, but it's wonderful. It is
right. So it's a nice lead up, right, to the momentum
right
of that movement.
It
Absolutely.
Goes back to the 1600s, and it's just
wow.
It's Jack Gannon, who's one of my heroes.
Keith, do you or Heather have any books that, and are there any new podcast? I'm sure now that the young activists are doing all the TikTok.
Oh yes.
Right, like that's how they're now organizing through the computer with the TikTok.
Yes. Oh God, I have the TikTok and the Facegram and the Insta thing and the Facebook.
Exactly.
So,
but are there any other writers or folks that you want to briefly talk about, and then we're going to get into our last question?
Yes. I'll just point out two real quick. Alice Wong did Disability Visibility, which is editorial stories. You can also go to Ability Magazine. They have the top 30 activists, movers, leaders, and shakers. There are a bunch of young and up and coming people of color, indigenous people around the country who are doing more social media content, more developmental content in terms of, specifically for the Historical Cultural Society. Looking at the youth will tell you how well or how bad we have passed on our history by the topics that they're discussing and the resources. And last but not least, my good friend Leroy Moore is also a member of the Disability Justice Movement, has several books on disability, intersectionality, and race. So, and his newest book.
Thank you.
There you go.
And shout out to Leroy. He just got accepted into UCLA. He's going to be repping hard down there. Heather, is there any book that you'd like to recommend?
Well, Keith took all of my recommendations, but I was also thinking about, younger advocates like Kia Brown, who has the pretty one, and she talks about, having cerebral palsy, and, her advocacy and her writing. There are so many others. Another younger advocate who does a lot of organizing is, let me see if I can say this, Amaranthia Sapia. She does a lot of work regarding mental health advocacy. And so I'm so inspired by a lot of what the younger folks are doing, because they're just like so galvanized in a way that, is just really, really heartening. But there is another book by Fannie Lou Hamer, who I just brought up, who is a post-polio survivor. And this just came out. So I've been reading this. It's wow. And this is by Dr. Keisha Blaine. So this is pretty good. Just came out this month.
Nice.
I want to give a shout out to Sings Invalid.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And they have a book called the Disability Justice Primer or Primer.
Oh, yes.
And that's wonderful. That's really wonderful.
Awesome. Well, and I think, it's also so important that we recognize and follow people who are of the community, right? And not just, get our history from people who want to, give it from us. And Fred, you getting the voices directly from, from you getting the stories directly from the mouths of the horse's mouth, right? And that's where we know. I worked for Harry Belafonte for a while, and he always used to say how much he wished that those SNCC meetings were recorded, right? Yeah. Because it wasn't just what they did at SNCC, it was when they were sitting in those rooms fighting over policy, right? Being like, we're not going to give that up. We are going to, and that dance that Charlie, I'm sure you can, think back to stories of many a night, right? When you were putting some finishing touches on policy and a bunch of passionate people were fighting for their liberation. And that's really the movement. It's that dance. It's not just the outcomes, right? It's not just the outcomes. So we have one final question here, and I'm actually just going to direct it to Charlie, because I also want to give us just some room for some closing thoughts. So I'm going to ask you, Charlie, if you can take a minute to talk about, do you think that disability rights activists face a double standard when it comes to motivations about activism?
A double standard. Be more specific.
So they're asking, that a lot of folks get involved politically out of survival, but is there a double standard there for activists that are coming in? And this is from Rich Karen of the ED of Emerging America. So I don't know if you know him, and that may help understand the context a little more. But, that's the question. Do disability rights activists face a double standard?
Well, here's my issue. This may not answer the question. Each of the disability groups, whether they're visible, not visible, whatever, are siloed. And that's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because we can understand each other more intimately and more realistically when we talk to each other with specifics about our agenda, our disabilities, and so on. It's not good because we're siloed and we're less powerful. And there is a lot of infighting, by the way, that goes on. It's just natural. It's life. What we need to do, though, and we're beginning to recognize, God help us, and we'll be successful, is to then go for inclusion into the broader social justice realm. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement, for me, sparked that idea. Look, I went to a Black Lives Matter rally, and I got there, and it was not accessible. The podium was not accessible. I went as a white ally, and I had something to say. I couldn't say it. We need to work together because, one, we share the same things: oppression, discrimination, marginalization, poverty, on and on and on. If we don't get our act together and work with each other, we'll be that much less powerful. So I don't think that answered the question, but that's kind of where I think we need to be collectively moving.
I say what though? I'm glad that question inspired that, because that was a word, Charlie. I mean, that really is that's the future. And when we think about Keith, I'm going to kick it to you to talk to us about the future, and then we're going to go to Heather and Fred. So again, I'm going to ask you guys to be quick. But, I know you often talk about who are the Black men that are getting killed by cops, right? 50% of them are Black men with disabilities. So let's talk about that too. But Keith, let's end on the note that Charlie was talking about, us coming together.
Yes.
Tell us, just give us one sentence about what the future looks like for you.
Well, the sentence that the future looks like for me is a tagline I tweet out a lot. We are not a fully realized movement until we are a fully inclusive movement. Everything that Charlie's talking about has been part of the work. So being the only Black person at a transgender event for people who are deaf, who are looking for ASL interpretation. Let's talk about, the intersection of disability and immigration. So I'm not really interested in silos. If I'm in the disability leadership movement and the only thing you're interested in is the particular topic that brought you here, you're not here for social justice. You're here for recognition. You don't get rich doing this stuff. I want to be out of work. I don't want to die in activism. I want the issues to be solved. And so, ironically, Charlie is my mentor. We did policy work. They took over the thing. We changed the landscape. We go back. So the future looks like me sitting on the beach, my kids being able to get up and go and be who they are in the fullness of their humanity, and have a society that is receptive of that, regardless of whether they have a disability or not. But specifically for us, being real quick, is that the future looks like the Mass Historical Society will take this, encapsulate it, and we will inculcate it into the education of our youth.
Thank you.
I want to add one quick thing before we stop. People with disabilities are the poorest minority, marginalized population in the state, in the country, and in the world. And equity to me, justice to me, means that I have a job, because otherwise we're poor, and poor people get squat, right? And we're supposed to be clamoring with happiness that we get an SSI or an SSDI check that is annually less than $12,000 to live on. We've got to get out of the, yep, I'll take the dole, and hey, I want a job. And that's what equity means.
I love it. I love it. Heather, give us a last word, and then Fred, you'll take us home.
It's really about the connective tissue that we have all up and through the community. There's no place where disability will not be found. I mean, as a Black disabled woman, mother, caregiver, and community builder, all of that, it has informed my self-awareness and my advocacy. So if we connect, if we sort of showcase that range, that nuance, and that complexity, more people will see themselves, mirrored in the mainstream in that way, and really recognize that all of those, that all of the granularity, right, in this grand mosaic that we call life here. So yeah, that connective tissue.
Thank you. And Fred.
I would go back to one of the earliest slogans of the movement, at least that I ran into, and that was nothing about us without us. And the idea that people need to have input into how their lives unfold. As a society and all through history, we've seen decisions come from on high. And not only is that unjust, but it's unpractical. We have a climate that is falling to pieces, a planet that is not going to be sustained for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We have so many inequities, and it all comes down to people being marginalized and not having a voice in their own destiny. So it's a great slogan from the disability community that is a gift that is bequeathed to the rest of the world. Nothing about us without us.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. And Gavin, thank you for the platform. And I want to thank everyone for letting me moderate this conversation. It was an absolute honor. And I love knowing about history. So Charlie, I'm going to be following up so we can get that drink and I can hear all the good organizing stories. I like gossip.
Looking forward to it.
Charlie, your oral history is online at the Berkeley Library, I mean,
yeah, I do. I said some things I wish I didn't.
Oh no.
That's my
We're going to
job.
have to sneak in there and get it out, Fred. We're going to have to sneak in there and replace the tape.
That's my job, is to get people to say things like that. So
thank you all for joining us, and thanks to all the members of the audience. This was a fantastic program. It was really a great way to wrap up the series. And I hope people will also appreciate our co-sponsors. I'm going to share my screen and just list them. So thanks to all the different organizations that have helped us promote this. And I hope everyone has a great day, and I hope the wind has stopped blowing outside. So,
thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh.